Greetings of the day, everyone. This is Rohit Mathur, your host for the session today around global transformation of payroll initiatives. I head the HR and payroll practice at Ramco. And in today's session, which is around multi-country outsourcing, we have invited two of our esteemed panel members from diverse backgrounds. The idea was to seek perspective around this topic from an end user organization and also analyst perspective who are reading the tea leaves and giving the market trends around how this initiative are moving. With me today, I have Jessica Fro. She's head of Standard Chartered Bank Global Payroll. She's based in Singapore and has been with Standard Chartered Bank for last 5 years, playing variety of roles. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her experience around the entire transformation journey of payroll at Standard Chartered Bank, and also around the transformation journey and seek her views on how does she see the payroll outsourcing. We also have another esteemed analyst, Anil Vijayan from Everest Group. Uh, Anil has been with Everest for last 5 years again, and he's been playing varied roles there, based out of Bangalore. His analyst focus area and the research area is prominently around HR and talent and upcoming technologies like AI, RPA, so on and so forth. And I think it'll be interesting to have his views around how he sees the evolution of multi-country payroll, having spent several years in analyzing and tracking this market. So welcome to both of you. And I also see a great audience joining in from different parts of the world today. We'll try and keep the session as interactive as possible. You can put your questions on the comment box out there, and we'll try and take it during the course of the discussion. And if there are some unanswered questions, we'll try and possibly answer them offline. Coming back on the session, we all agree that payroll as a subject area has been evolving in recent times, largely with the advent of globalization, where more and more organizations are looking at expanding their footprint across the globe, including the small-sized and the medium-sized organization as well. Also, the digital world coming out with innovations that are claiming to sort of automate the entire payroll process to a large extent and make it much more frictionless as far as the operations are concerned. And lastly, I think the millennials taking over as a large part of our workforce, and they demanding sort of an organization experience, as we call them, and also expecting a larger transparency in the processes and the system. So while the evolution was happening, I guess the current context around the pandemic has accelerated this entire process, and organizations who were still evaluating this strategy are sort of now getting into the execution mode and trying to see how they can fasten their entire process out there. And with the rapid changes that are happening around statutory compliances or the disruption of the workforce that we also saw as a result of pandemic, I think is forcing a lot of organizations to go back to the drawing board to redraft their payroll strategy. And I guess the starting point around the payroll strategy itself is the entire conundrum around whether to keep the payroll in-house or outsource to a third-party vendor. And I guess there are debates in multiple quarters and multiple associations around that. So with that as a background, maybe let me put my first question to you, Anil, on how you see this entire conundrum around in-house versus outsourced payroll span out. And what's your take around the market trend? Where do you see the market moving as far as the payroll strategy is concerned around this?
Yeah, so Rohit, I think there's no one size fits all here, right? So there are a wide range of solutions out there, right from completely in-house to completely outsourced. Even within outsourcing, it can vary by processes outsourced. So you can have, for instance, in one case, you can have end-to-end processes outsourced, And in another case, you can have only last mile and tax outsourced. You can also have a few countries outsourced in one scenario and pretty much all in another. Now, where you end up on the spectrum really depends on a wide variety of factors, including the nature of the organization, its employee population, the sourcing maturity, and so on. But from a payroll outsourcing perspective, we typically see two types of solution constructs. One is single country payroll, where individual country payrolls are outsourced to different providers. And then you have multi-country payroll, where several countries are outsourced to one provider. Now, it's important to bring in the distinction that multi-country payroll is not just a summation of single country payroll scenarios, but rather it's a solution which, while it has several payroll engines under it, it also has an overarching platform on top that ensures visibility, governance, analytics, and standardization across countries. So if we look at it from that perspective, while single country payroll is growing as well, it is growing at a much smaller single-digit growth rate, whereas multi-country payroll adoption is growing at a very fast pace, right? It's upwards of 15%. And this is simply because beyond the traditional payroll outsourcing benefits of cost saving, multi-country payroll also provides much greater visibility, analytics insights, more control, and it also leads to additional benefits like lower payroll leakage, for instance. Now, as far as the trend is concerned, in a post-COVID scenario, some of these benefits become even more pronounced. And hence, I actually expect the adoption of multi-country payroll in particular to at least sustain, if not go up considerably.
Very true, Anil, and I think the trends that we are spotting in our market is very, very similar. Jessica, you've been an early adopter of the outsourcing, and you've gone the multi-country route. What were the trends that you spotted, and why at all did you take that approach up?
Maybe it would help if I shared a little bit about what Standard Chartered looks like and what our current setup from a payroll perspective is and where we are on that journey. So Standard Chartered is in around 70 locations. We have about 80,000 employees and quite a unique footprint, so quite strong in Africa and Asia. Now, in terms of payroll setup today, we've got a strong operations team led out of our shared service center in India. Then we have the Center of Excellence, or the ownership, sitting here in Singapore in a small team. And of course, we've got on-the-ground country HR teams that cover a multitude of HR processes. Helping us, of course, we have our vendors, a handful actually of large vendors covering between 9 to 18 markets each. Ramco, of course, is one of those. And the remaining countries are with smaller vendors or in-house. Now, we are on a journey, like you said, we're somewhere on that spectrum. So we're still going. So it started back in 2015-16 when we started this transformation. We're at the moment implementing a vendor in Africa to cover our African market. And looking to the future for the next 4 or 5 years, we're planning for fuller automation. And I think we'll see some of that coming up today.
Awesome. Jessica, you brought a very important point around the structure, local versus consolidated. So Anil, what I understand from you on how this trend around decisions being taken at the local level or the entire payroll being taken as a consolidated strategy spanning out. Are you seeing more multi-country adoption rather than single country adoption? What are the trends there, and how do you see that market spanning out in future as well?
Yeah, so as far as the decision making is concerned, if you look at single country payroll outsourcing, we typically see individual countries' business units making that decision, or at least heavily influencing it. Now, when it comes to multi-country, again, it really depends on the nature of the organization and the decision-making modalities within that organization, right? So in very centralized organization, for instance, you would often have the decision, even for multi-country payroll, being made at a HQ level. So while inputs may come in from other countries and regions, it's still made at headquarters. In fact, in many cases, there are two components to the decision making. So for instance, in US headquartered firms, we do see that the call on US payroll is generally done separately, and it is either run internally or with a particular provider, right? Then the global payroll is decisioned separately, and it's outsourced to another vendor altogether. Now, in more federated organizations, we actually also see regional decisions being made. So APAC decisions are made, or at least heavily influenced at a regional APAC level. Same for Europe and other regions. Increasingly, we are seeing a bit of a trend towards decisions actually being made at a regional level, at least in the larger organizations.
Right. Anil, a very important point that you brought about around centralization and standardization. And I think somewhere execution sort of becomes a little bit of challenge in those areas. And that's what particularly we have seen, where while the decision has been taken centrally, somehow the local offices tend to defend the local partners out there and not take the consolidated strategy. And I think it's about how you socialize or bring them on board early on so that they get a holistic view of the strategy rather than their own regional aspect. On that part, Jessica, I think Standard Chartered Bank has done a fairly great job out there because the consolidated strategy spanned out very well, and I think it was executed very well. Any quick experience that you want to share on how you went about the entire consolidated strategy there?
Sure. As I mentioned, payroll is centrally run from this team, but in this transformation journey, it has been a collaboration with the country HR teams. So far, we haven't had any country drop out of the transformation program. Everyone's come on board, and we receive feedback and pushback from some locations. It could be around language considerations, or they're used to working with their current provider. And working together, showing the benefits of the model that we're moving towards, analyzing those against risk, cost, effort. So far, like you say, we've been quite successful. The only time we have had, I guess, countries drop out of our transformation program is actually due to external factors. So as a bank, we're regulated, and in some locations, regulators would prohibit us from outsourcing or offshoring certain processes, payroll being one. So for example, Indonesia remains with the local provider and locally managed.
Sorry, Jessica, that brings me to the point. Since you have gone towards the multi-country strategy, what were your drivers there, and what were the imperatives that forced you to look at multi-country and not go individual country-wise? So, what was your take, and what's the experience around that?
Sure, I think there was probably three main drivers for us. The first one being around specialist or skill availability. When you're looking at an in-house model versus an outsourced model, as I mentioned, we're in 70 locations. So if we kept it in-house, there'd be 70 payroll teams having to find talent in each of those markets to keep payroll running, keeping up with legislative change or keeping technology up to date for each individual payroll. Being able to cope with unforeseen circumstances, and good example of the pandemic we're in today. So I think the specialist skill was the first one. Secondly, cost control, and I know that's big for many organizations. You can achieve economies of scale going into a multi-country vendor arrangement. You can reduce your own headcount in terms of payroll management. And we did a bit of a comparison looking at our country HR teams in 2016 versus today, and the amount of time that they were spending on payroll, and we found that's decreased by almost 40%. Of course, our operations hub in India that supports payroll has increased slightly, but at a much lower cost. And the third big one for us is around compliance. and risk. So as I mentioned, we're a highly regulated industry, and payroll is a huge risk area for us, moving billions of dollars each year. So we've got multiple control points and tests in place to make sure that those risks are mitigated. Now, if you've got to replicate that in 70 markets or 70 platforms, it's much harder to do than having one multi-country vendor in place.
Yeah. Another thing, Jessica, probably that I've heard from some of the organization is, how they are wanting to use payroll as more strategic function rather than operational aspect. And that's one of the drivers that they're really working towards, which means they sort of automate the entire payroll processing and utilize that workforce bandwidth for doing meaningful analysis around the data, because payroll has such a huge data hidden inside, and possibly bring out the trends on the spend or the cost. And I think that enables the business leaders to take decisions around where they need to spend their money and how their budget is getting allocated, especially when all of them are looking at expansion across the globe. So I think that's also one of the drivers that we are seeing, that the payroll as a function is looking more to move towards a strategic value in the organization rather than just being operational. Also, Anil, from your perspective, what do you think are those drivers? And I'm also curious to understand from you, are there some geography or regions which are sort of adopting this much more than the others? Is there a geography pattern out here?
So in terms of key drivers, the way we look at it, there are two types, right? So one is the more traditional, or maybe more, in some ways, more fundamental drivers of cost, compliance, and expertise, as Jessica also mentioned. And I'll also throw in there control and visibility, right? So these are, of course, important and continue to be important. But you also have another set of drivers, which are next generation drivers. These are not fundamental at this point, but they are certainly gaining in importance. And these are things like access to technology, insights and analytics, employee experience, and so on. Now, to answer your second question, Rohit, we are actually seeing across the board adoption for multi-country payroll. Of course, North America and Europe are largest markets because of the economic activity. But APAC is very significant. It constitutes around a quarter of the market, and it is actually growing at several percentage points above the market rate. And of course, I'm sure you would know this since Ramco is a player in the APAC space as well. So apart from that, if we look at buyer characteristics, I would say that all sizes of buyers adopt multi-country payroll. But majority of the growth is really coming from small to mid-sized buyer segment, right? It's growing much faster. This is natural, again, because many of these smaller firms are increasingly going global. And as they seek to expand, they need payroll in more countries. And of course, they are becoming more aware of the benefits of a multi-country payroll construct.
All right. I'll just move on to another pointer here before I take a couple of questions. I think we have some of them popping up. But Anil, these drivers that you're talking about, are these getting sort of changed or becoming more imperative with the changing business situation around the pandemic? Do you see any shift in these drivers, or are the new drivers coming up, especially in the background of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think in the context of the pandemic itself, I think, a few things have been revealed to us, or a few things have been reinforced, right, in the world of business at least. So one is, of course, digital transformation is critical, right? It's clear that organizations which were ahead in their digital journeys, they were not only able to cater to their employees and work from home scenario much better, but they were also able to cater to their clients much better, right? So in essence, they ended up being more resilient from a business perspective, and this is one key driver which has started to become much more important: resilience, right? So apart from this fundamental truth of digital transformation, I think the other one is, of course, we find ourselves in recessionary times. We can talk around the issue and talk about recovery and its characteristics and so on. But I think fundamentally we have to acknowledge that these are tough times, and there is still a great deal of uncertainty. So we will need to think about survival measures as businesses, things like cutting cost or cutting down on cost, maintaining tighter control on spends and so on. Those are all a reality that we live in. If you put both of these together, we can see that multi-country payroll solutions are actually in a sweet spot. Because when done right, they can certainly help accelerate the digital journey and resilience as well, by providing better technology, standardization, analytics, automation. At the same time, they can help cut costs, provide more visibility and control on things like payroll leakage without any huge initial outlay. So all put together, I think MCP or multi-country payroll drivers are still very much in force, and some of these have been accentuated by the pandemic. Again, roadblocks to adoption are not that insurmountable either. So in that sense, I think now is as good a time as any to be thinking about these kind of solutions.
And Jessica, how did you think the entire transformation journey, which you had already undertaken and you were one of the early adopters, helped you tide over this situation? Because you already had most of those systems and processes in place. So what's your take around this situation?
Yeah, I think it's actually really helped highlight how well placed we are to handle payroll during this pandemic. So we have not missed any payroll dates. Everyone's been paid in every country on time, regardless of lockdowns or even lockdowns in India where the operations team are. And we've continued to deliver above and beyond. So not only delivering on the regular payroll side, but special COVID allowances in some locations have been necessary, early payroll runs in some locations to mitigate the risk of upcoming lockdowns, and a big global donation drive to raise funds to go towards COVID. So the benefit of having a handful of multi-country vendors is that you send that instruction to, in our case, 3 or 4 vendors to make the change and get the donation system in place. So it's made this period of time much easier than I think it could have otherwise been.
Awesome. Well, on that note, I think we have a couple of questions, and I might want to bring up 1 or 2 questions from the audience. We have a question from, say, Shadrinathan, and his question is, how does a HR package standalone survive in any industry? Are there any business integration areas which need to be further integrated with the HR module, which could be tougher during the new system implementation? What's your view on this? I guess, Jessica, maybe you are well positioned to answer this question, because I think you have made some integrations at your end, and probably how a multi-country scenario or a single platform aided you in doing that. I guess that's the question that I can understand.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's hugely beneficial if you're only doing it once and you're only doing one integration, or in our case, a handful of integrations. Obviously, we need integration to allow that automation, only having to do it one time. And when you change, I mean, right now, actually, we're going through an internal transformation with our HR systems. So that's migrating. And of course, we're then having to migrate that integration with the payroll vendors. But again, it's only with 3 or 4 rather than potentially 70. So I think that's a key benefit there.
All right. I have yet another one coming in, which is from Kurt. How will you handle country versions for places like Mongolia, where there is a rise in the economy and not much tech development up to now? Jessica, any view there?
I mean, we're in pretty much every country you can think of. We haven't had any challenges so far. I mean, we are all on, maybe it helps that SCB, we're all on the same internal HR system, perhaps with the exception of Korea at the moment, but pretty much all on that one system. So that helps. I haven't found any technology challenges in some of the more unique locations. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the challenges in some of those locations for us have been more regulatory.
Yeah, and to add on from my side, Good, I think what we have really seen is the moment you have a technology platform, and it's a common technology platform, all you have to do is ensure that you get the right statutory and compliances in place and model them into the software. So as long as you have a sound technology backbone, I think it then only restricts to the kind of compliance specifications that you can source from any advisory firm or a consulting firm. So don't see that as a challenge, because we also support some of these countries. And again, since the operations can happen in an outsourced manner remotely, I don't think so that really poses a challenge as far as the services in those countries are concerned. All right, let me move on to our next set of questions here. Jessica, the question to you, how do you think the entire transformation journey at Standard Chartered Bank was enabled? And what will you call the enablers in your entire transformation journey? And I'll probably then head back to Anil on what he thinks about it.
Sure. Maybe I'll stick to the non-tech side first of all. So I think for us, a lot of that groundwork was important in enabling the success that we've had. So the team structure that I mentioned earlier, evaluating that and getting the right team structure in place to support the transformation, really understanding current processes in country. Each one could be pretty unique. So I think understanding requirements up front and developing our strategy from there before perhaps jumping into the quick, let's outsource this to XYZ provider. I think doing that background piece was really important. And then when choosing between a multi-country payroll vendor, as we have with Ramco, or multiple multi-country payroll vendors, as we have a handful of, I think it was important to evaluate the pros and cons of those two approaches. So for us, we're a large organization. We can still split up our countries into meaningful chunks and have them with multi-country payroll vendors, evaluating the risk of moving all 70 into one versus splitting them up, looking at things like competitiveness between vendors. On the con side. Now, of course, on the benefit side, and I guess what we could potentially lose out on a little by the model that we've adopted is the ease and speed of those operations. Of course, with one vendor, the analytics, the reporting, the vendor management, change management, invoicing is all going to be that little bit easier when you've got one multi-country vendor as opposed to our model with 3 or 4. But I think, weighing everything up, given our size, I think it's been the right decision for us, but it may not be suited to everyone.
Perfect. I think one of the very important points that you brought up, Jessica, is around how you didn't lift and shift your processes, and I think you took that opportunity to sort of streamline them, because I think once you're embarking on such a journey, it's important to sort of take a step back and see how you can reconstruct your processes, make them much more standardized, make them much more consolidated. And I guess that's probably one of the reasons of your success in this transformation journey. Question back to you, Anil, on how do you see from a market perspective how these enablers are evolving with the continuous business demands of today?
Yeah, so I think at an overarching level, transformation, of course, has several components. And I think, Jessica very rightly pointed to this as well. Well, technology is important. It's not the only enabler. So from an enterprise perspective, I think it's key to focus on the desired business outcome, work backwards, and use these various levers to design a solution that can achieve that outcome. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit of a vanity project. So if you look at it from that perspective, on a holistic basis, you need to look at your people and process levers, right? And also operating model also falls into this, right? So right from re-engineering, centralization, and Rohit, you mentioned the standardization, to things like composition of talent and expertise for optimized delivery. And then you factor in considerations such as cost and location constraints, offshore, nearshore, work from home, outsourced, and so on, right? Then you have tech levers, and these are increasingly varied. And it becomes important to cut through some of the jargon and think about where these are actually appropriate. So, for one, you have infra-based levers as well. You have cloud versus on-premise, and then you have systems of record like HCMs and other systems of record. And then you have smaller systems which supplement the systems of record, which is things like payroll, benefits, and so on. So all of these systems together, they constitute your tech baseline. And then we have other next generation technologies coming into play, which serve predominantly two purposes. So one is they fill in the gap in the tech baseline that you have, and two, they enhance the ability of some of these tech baseline components. So you would have heard about these solutions pretty much in every conversation these days. So these would include solutions like robotic process automation, AI-based solutions, both for automation and for advanced analytics, blockchain, process mining, and so on. Again, just to reiterate, while looking at technology, it is going to be easy to be drawn to that next shiny object. But what is really meaningful at the end of the day is getting all of this to work together seamlessly to deliver tangible business outcomes.
Yeah. Anil, and I think the analyst community, as you pointed out, is often accused of throwing these jargons, and I sort of won't let you go away without spending a little more time on these jargons. So you do hear a lot of these buzzwords around technology space that are sort of impacting the payroll, be it RPA, be it blockchain, be it AI. What's your take on how really are they impacting the payroll process, and how much of usage do you see of these technologies in the payroll sector? I think it'll be important to understand that bit, because there are a whole lot of sessions around how these technologies going to take the payroll to the next level. But I would want to really understand what's the real adoption and what are those technologies that you think would really make an impact in this sector.
Yeah, and so as you mentioned, these some of these jargons are occupational hazards for me. But as we look at payroll and look to contextualize some of the technologies, I think automation in particular certainly does play a key role, right? So it can certainly help us move towards that ideal goal of end-to-end touchless payroll. So, for instance, you have RPA, which can be used in various kinds of data transfer situations. It can be used in, let's say, things like pre and post validation in payroll. It can be used for reconciliations. All of these end up enabling quicker payroll runs, and often with lower error rates and at a lower cost. Then you have AI-based solutions, right? And again, a variety of use cases here. Some of these are still in experimental phase, and we are still scratching the surface on some of these, right? But I think the prominent ones today are you have virtual agents or chatbots for employee queries. Now, not only does this enable automation by tackling some of the volumes that comes in as part of the employee contact center, but it can also help improve experience, because chatbots can be deployed 24/7 and without much interruption, right? So apart from automation, you can also have AI-based solutions for other things such as anomaly detection and prevention. Again, this simply enables you to catch issues with payroll based on previous patterns and historical data, or all of it is machine learning enabled. And then you have predictive analytics, various use cases being explored here, from prediction of leave and absence to estimating attrition and so on. So now all of these tools actually have greater impact than what is immediately visible, right? So because the sum of these actually tends to be, or rather, when you put this together, it tends to be greater than the sum of these, right? The impact. So imagine, for instance, that the payroll runtime and cost is significantly reduced due to automation, This in turn opens up a world of other possibilities, such as on-demand payroll, right? One of the reasons why we today follow a fixed monthly or a weekly pay cycle is that it simply requires considerable effort, cost, and time for a payroll run. There are, of course, other issues such as cash flow, etc. But once we remove the barrier of complexity and cost, then many organizations may be willing to experiment with off-cycle pay runs. And this could be, again, particularly useful in times like these when there are cash flow issues in many households, right? So again, the benefits of automation may actually extend beyond that of the transactional and cost saving to more strategic outcomes like employee experience, talent retention, and so on.
Absolutely, Anil. And I think we have seen some of these real tangible benefits out of some of the technologies that you did mention. I think the employee experience side of it, but also is resulting into substantial help desk workforce reduction. Some of the customers that we've been talking to who are extensively using the chatbot platform, they claim that while there is the employee delight because they get their answers upfront, this is also resulting into almost 50 to 60% reduction in their help desk workforce, which obviously can be leveraged for much larger purposes out there. Also, you mentioned around the anomaly detection and validation. I think it's a huge manual area right now where a lot of efforts are spent in finding out the anomalies based on the past patterns or validating it with the earlier payroll, and that's all manual. These anomaly engines is that the entire process also gets reduced by almost half. And some of the POCs that we've done around these with our beta customers is definitely pointing out the direction. So I guess chatbots and AI definitely are sort of resulting into tangible benefits that one can see across the customer base. On that note, Jessica, what's Standard Chartered Bank's take on the new technology levers, and in your future journey, how do you see sort of weaving them into the journey there?
Sure. Like you say, we're still on that journey. So at the moment, kind of getting our basics right. But I am really excited for the future and what automation can bring to the payroll process. And we talked a little bit there about query management, and we did an analysis on our help desk, not just the payroll help desk, the overall HR help desk. And they worked out that per year, they probably spend equivalent to 4 full-time employees just managing payroll queries. Plus, of course, the internal payroll team queries. I can see that that's going to be a key area for chatbot assistance for us. We also talked about controls and tests earlier, and you mentioned here some anomaly flags. I mean, that would be a place that we'd be really excited about. We're highly regulated. Our risk owners, our auditors, our regulators are always looking at payroll, checking the tests are working, and having an automated function to flag up discrepancies would mean less building of manual tests in the process for us. All of that together, a reduction in manpower, or I should say a change in the traditional payroll role and a move to that strategic end.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I have a couple of automation related questions that I can see popping up on my window. And let me take one or two of them. Some of the questions related to automation. Yeah, what skills does HR need to possess to drive payroll domain while it is getting fully automated with technologies like AI? So this question from Janendra. And Anil, would you want to take a shot at this one?
Sure. So I would say that we are still some way away from it getting fully automated, right? So in that sense, I think we still have some. I think we have a long way to go, actually. Let me put it that way. Large parts of it, of course, can be automated. So with that in mind, let me talk about what the skill sets would be within HR or even within payroll, right? So one would definitely be exception handling, right? So when we are talking about a lot of the transactional work getting managed, that means what remains is what is not, automatable, right? So maybe higher order, more judgment-oriented tasks, which ultimately end up as exceptions or are passed on to, human beings, right? So the chatbot example, for instance, if the chatbot is not able to field a certain question, then it passes on to a live agent. So those kind of skills, domain-centric skills, will still remain very relevant. I think the other area is, and we probably should not overlook this, but the human component of HR, right, that will still remain. So the role of HR as someone who provides that human touch and connection to employees, that is certainly a skill set which is definitely going to be relevant even in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a little far away for the chatbot to get those human touch right now. Yet another question popping up from Gerard. What are the trade-off between using payroll engines that are embedded within a large enterprise application and a standalone one? Anil, again, it's related to platform. Would you mind taking a look at this one?
Sure. So there are a few angles to it, right? So one is, again, payroll engines are, embedded in maybe, other, larger systems as well, right? Some may be as part of HCM, some may be as part of larger ERPs and so on. I think what we also need to figure out as we solve for the multi-country payroll question is also the services part of it, right? Now, payroll engine is one part of it. And of course, you may have an employee population distribution, which is, which is maybe concentrated in certain countries, and then you have a longer tail of smaller employee populations. So a lot of the questions then become about cost effectiveness of running payroll, and that spreads across both the engines and the services that you want to deliver. If you have a long tail of countries, would you want to kind of have that engine, or do you think it is kind of worthwhile to do that engine plus the services in-house itself, or would you want to look at another third-party provider who can provide it maybe at a somewhat more reasonable rate and so on? These are some of the questions which really pop up. Now, there are other considerations. I think we will end up covering that later, and that falls into the whole multi-country payroll construct itself, of whether you want the gross to net engines to be handled by one provider or through partners and so on. But I think I'll answer that part of it maybe somewhere later in this conversation.
Absolutely, Anil. Thanks for that. And I think the previous question, I also had a point out there around the entire skill set that's required for the HR, given that most of the stuff can get automated or will get automated. I think it's all about how you hone up your analytical abilities, because then it's all about studying those patterns and giving meaningful insights to the business. So skills around analytics, skills around business intelligence, I think those will be something that will be sort of much sought after if all the operational processes are to get automated, and the processes around payroll would require less of human intervention. With that, let me move on to my next set of questions, Anil. And the questions are generally asked for service providers like us, is around how the ancillary services are sort of getting evolved with the payroll, and what kind of additional services is being expected out of a provider, and are they still considering a single provider for all their payroll services requirements? So what are those services that are also getting evolved around with the payroll processing?
Yeah, so Rohit, as I mentioned, I think multi-country payroll generally tends to be tied at the hip with services, right? So although there is a technology component with the platform coming in, the benefits of multi-country payroll really come to bear when complemented by services, right? From those around compliance and regulation to gross to net, last mile tax filings, advanced analytics, and so on. Now, there are other ancillary services, of course, and these may be sought outside of the payroll construct itself. But increasingly, we are seeing some of these being clubbed or included in multi-country payroll contracts. So these include things like expense management. You have services like expat payroll and shadow payroll. Additionally, some of the more mature firms today also seek value from different kind of solutions which fall in the same sphere of payroll, but it's somewhat further removed, right? These are value-added solutions. So these include things like financial wellness. Generally, it's tied to payroll and benefits. So you can have apps, for instance, that promote financial wellness, including budgeting tools, decision support mechanisms for investments, and so on. On-demand pay, I already briefly touched upon, and these are generally enabled through digital wallets, and they provide the ability to access funds already earned as and when the employee chooses. Now, often tied to digital wallets, we also find marketplaces, right? And these are usually to enable purchases related to wellness, like you have add-on health insurance, etc. So net, there's a whole ecosystem of apps and services developing around core payroll solutions itself. This is not to say that it's necessarily the norm today, but you can see why as we switch to an increasingly digital world, adoption of these will also likely increase.
Yeah, sure. And I do see a lot of these services being sought after by the customers to sort of complete the bouquet around payroll services. So, Jessica, how do you see this from an end user organization, and what are your sort of likely demands around the payroll services?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with some of the more, I guess, basic or traditional payroll services. I guess I was quite surprised to find out when we started our journey and we started looking country by country, what services do they currently utilize, how do they currently manage their payrolls. And actually, there's various parts of the payroll process that they'd outsourced or kept in-house. So from money movement services to actually, paying the employees. Some countries were using vendor support for that. Although as a bank, where we have retail presence, that wasn't as necessary. Lodgement services, so physically filing relevant payroll declarations with authorities. Again, that varied because on the ground, in certain locations, you might physically need to go to the local authorities to hand those in. So certain provinces in China. And query management, that's something that we hear a lot when we're speaking to our countries, that something that vendors could help with, payroll query management. So I think those were kind of the traditional ancillary services. Then looking to the future and what we're talking about mainly here today, that analytics functionality, I think that would be the big win for us if we only had one multi-country payroll vendor. You'd have access to all of that data in one place. Now, for us and probably a lot of organizations, you could access pre-payroll data, perhaps yourselves, you could amalgamate that. But it's very hard for us, and I imagine other organizations, to access post-payroll data. We don't have a consolidated repository of that information. And at the moment, as I said, we've got a handful of vendors, so we would need to go kind of vendor to vendor to build up that global picture. And we also explored looking at our finance records and group finance, but we didn't find that had enough granularity to really be able to paint a good analytics picture. So it's in our strategy over the next 4 or 5 years that we're really working on bringing that analytics function together, and companies like Ramco will be supporting us on that journey.
Right. Thanks, Jessica. I think you touched upon again the platform and the engine, and I think somewhere Gerald from the audience had a question around this to Anil as well. And I think that we might want to dwell a little more onto that. So I think organizations who are sort of taking this transformation journey, they are still struggling with what kind of model to go after. Do they need to have one single platform, one single engine to do that? Do they need to tie up with multiple local providers and trying to aggregate them? I think that's sort of always still remains a matter of debate. So Anil, maybe you could help us sort of demystify that, point out some of the trends that you're seeing in the market, and I guess the preferred models that you think most of your customers are looking forward to.
Absolutely, and I think one of the reasons why I kind of held on to that answer is because I have a slide to bring up. So let me just bring up that slide to illustrate the point. All right, so hopefully you can see the slide. So currently there are 3 prevalent solution models in the multi-country payroll world, right? Multi-country payroll outsourcing world. And these are on the extreme left you have the pure platform model where the multi-country payroll vendor does payroll for all countries and owns the gross to net engines for all countries in scope. Okay. Then on the extreme right you have the pure aggregator model where individual country payroll is achieved through in-country partners or ICPs with the multi-country payroll vendor just acting as the aggregation, governance, and the standardization layer on top. Now, hybrid is, of course, something which lies between the two. Okay, so you have certain engines which are within the platform, certain engines which are outside the platform. Now, naturally, the reason for not having fully owned gross to net engines in a particular country is typically economic. So the vendor maybe does not have enough volume for that country to be able to justify maintaining a gross to net engine and payroll serviceability, right? So in that sense, we may never get to a pure platform capable of serving all the countries in the world. However, the trend today clearly is to get as close as possible to that kind of a pure platform solution. Automation and centralization and greater volume is actually enabling a lot of service providers and vendors to do payroll on their own in countries where previously they were relying on partners as well. And from a buyer perspective also, it is most buyers prefer that kind of a construct since governance, integration, and support is generally better when one entity owns payroll and gross to net for all countries in scope. And then if you throw in considerations like COVID-19, for instance, of course, in many ways, it's easier to ensure resilience and business continuity if it is one entity rather than, an aggregator with several other entities underneath it. And you may not really know what kind of BCP plans are in place and so on and so forth. So from that sense, I think the move towards more of a platform, pure platform kind of model is being accelerated as a result of COVID-19 as well.
Very well said, and I think that's what we are also observing, Anil, and I think that's why as our strategy, I think we are purely going on the platform itself, and all the countries that we support are completely on our platform right from cross to net. So Jessica, what's your take around these preferred models, and what's your advice to organizations who are sort of taking this trajectory now?
Sure. Well, Standard Chartered, working with Ramco, we adopted the pure platform model. I think, as we've heard, that has several benefits to us: the consolidated reporting, consolidated inputs, speed and efficiency. But my kind of, I guess, key tips, or as we wrap up this session, I'd ask organizations who are just starting their journey to prepare a holistic strategy. So starting with your people and your processes, weighing up that cost benefit analysis, having discussions with organizations such as Ramco. And if you do decide to go on that journey and adopt a multi-country vendor approach, or even just outsourcing to one country to a single vendor, I'd say start small. Get a phased strategy in place. You can learn so much each time you do a transition. I mean, like I said, we've been on this journey for the past 5 years, and we've learned so much. If we started back at the beginning again, I'm sure there's things we'd do differently, but we've learned every time we bring a new country on, we learn something. So that would be my advice to organizations thinking about starting their journey.
Right. Very well said, Jessica. And I think just to sum this entire question up and taking clue from the trend that Anil pointed out, I think platform definitely seems to be the way forward. And some of the observations that we had from our customers is that they get a consistent quality if you have a single platform. You're not dependent on multiple providers in the region, which can probably offer you different level of services as well as different quality. Secondly, I think reporting, and since we've talked a lot in today's session around reporting and how the drill downs or how the insights can happen, that can only be enabled if you have the entire gross to net and the entire processing happening across the regions on a single platform, so that you can sort of see the trees among the forest there. And I think lastly, with all these changes that are coming as part of the COVID environment and continuously regulatory updates that were coming, I think it became much more easy to drive those changes through a single touch point across the globe, rather than having to fix it by different countries, by different platforms. So I guess that's probably a couple of other advantages that were brought to our notice when we were discussing with some of our customers. Well, I guess we are almost at the fag end of our session here. And I guess I'm getting the indications by my team to sort of wrap up the session itself, but probably we'll take some of them offline and we'll respond to you individually on that. Thanks once again for being a wonderful audience, and thank you, our esteemed panel, Jessica and Anil, for sharing your insights and experience with us. And I'm sure you enjoyed the session much more than I did conducting it. So thank you once again for being part of the panel, and please do stay tuned for more sessions coming from Ramco. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and stay safe.